Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome to our clinical trial webinar tonight. I am joined by a handful of our esteemed clinicians and clinical trialists from around the country to answer some of the questions that we've been hearing at the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. As 2020 came and went, and 2021 is here with a flurry of announcements about clinical trials, has come lots of excitement. But with that excitement, also significant anxiety and questions, understandable questions. And so our goal of tonight's session was to gather up as many questions from the community as we could ahead of time, and then throw these questions out to a panel of experts here. And I'll take a second to introduce our group, and then we're going to jump right in. I'll start by saying that the goal of tonight's informational session is really to be quite general and not specific about current ongoing clinical trials. We'll hear more tonight. Some things can be shared and some things can't be shared about current ongoing clinical trials. But the goal is to get some basic questions about clinical trials answered. So joining me tonight, I'm just going to go around my screen in order of who I see first. So I have Dr. Jessica Duis, who's a geneticist at the Children's Hospital of Colorado, who's been active in the clinical trial space in the Angelman syndrome community for quite some time. Wenhan Tan, who is a geneticist also at Boston Children's Hospital, also been quite active in clinical research studies within the Angelman space and other rare disease spaces. We have Elizabeth, webcam is not on, so we will hear from her but not necessarily see her. But she is a neurologist and clinical trialist at Rush. And then I'm also joined by Dr. Achilla Libanoff, who is a developmental behavioral pediatrician at Rush as well. So I appreciate you all taking your time to be here tonight. I don't think anyone else has joined us yet, and if they do, I will introduce them as we get to asking questions. So I'd love to just start off, and Dr. Duis, I'm gonna hit you first with the first question. And really, I would love for you just to give us an overview of kind of the purpose of a clinical trial. And when we're thinking about the different phases of a clinical trial, what do those mean? What's kind of the overarching goal of a clinical trial and some of those key terms that we think about in terms of phases? I can't hear you. Can anybody else? Yes, okay. I can hear you now. Perfect.
Sorry. It was not letting me unmute for some reason. Well, thank you for the first question. So the goal of a clinical trial is really to understand whether a drug therapy would be effective. And it depends on the particular phase of the study, what's being studied. So for a phase 1 trial or phase 2 trial like is ongoing in the community right now for antisense oligonucleotides from a couple of companies, those studies are really geared at understanding the safety profile. So for those studies, it includes both monitoring for safety in general, so for adverse outcomes related to drugs, but also to look at how does the body metabolize those drugs. So oftentimes there'll be additional blood draws or opportunities to look at how the body is kinetically, or how quickly the body is utilizing those drugs and how those get absorbed in the body. And so that's really the goal of the currently ongoing clinical trials. As you move forward with clinical trials and they move into subsequent phases, that's when individuals and companies really try to understand what the efficacy of the drug is. So how does the drug change the course of the disease? And that's where we're looking at specifically wanting to understand if there's a benefit of the drug compared often to a placebo arm, in which individuals do not know whether they're getting the drug itself or they're getting a a non-active drug to try to understand if there's any difference in how that individual responds to the drug. Now, some of those clinical trial designs may be changed depending on the benefit of the drug and the risks and benefits of administering a placebo arm or a group of individuals who don't actually get the drug. But in typical clinical trial design, we would expect potentially when you're really studying the efficacy or how well the drug works to treat the disease, you would have an arm of the study where they're not receiving drug.
Great. So that's really a nice overview of phase one. Phase one meant to be safety. It's telling us, is this drug safe and is it tolerated? And then phase two, really looking at more efficacy, and something that, you know, people might be seeing is kind of this hybrid model where we might see a phase 1-2 or multiple of these phases. And any insight into why we might be seeing phase 1-2 instead of just phase 1 or just phase 2, things like that?
Yeah, so oftentimes, particularly in rare disease, you'll see combining phase 1 and phase 2. So the primary outcome in those types of studies is still going to be around safety, sometimes around how do you dose the medication, and then the phase 2 part of it being that you're going to a general rare disease. Instead of going to a general population to study the safety, you're looking at it particularly in that rare disorder. And so oftentimes you'll see what we call secondary endpoints, where they're looking at clinical outcomes of using the drug. And we're seeing that more and more, particularly when we're talking about an area of drug development called personalized therapy. So these antisense oligonucleotides are particularly targeting the Angelman syndrome population, and that's where you can really start to look at some of those secondary endpoints that would look at how well the drug's working.
Thanks. And I should say, anybody else, feel free to chime in, jump in at any point. So I will throw this question to Dr. Tan, and I should also preface and say there may not be clear answers to some of these questions, but I'm pulling questions as they were given to us because these are the questions that people want answered. But a challenging question that we hear often is, so right now we might be seeing phase 1 or phase 2 of clinical trials. What's the sort of time frame that you might expect for a phase 3 clinical trial? So say a patient doesn't get a spot in a phase 1-2, when might we expect a phase 3 for a clinical trial? What's that timeline look like?
So that's a good question. It's a difficult question to answer because a lot depends on the outcomes of the phase 1 and phase 2 trial. So just to back up a little bit on what Dr. Duis had said, strictly speaking, a phase 1 trial is a trial that looks at what, in technical terms, it's called pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And you have heard of these terms, PK, PD, being thrown around. What it really boils down to is how the drug is absorbed, how much of the drug is absorbed, how much of it is eliminated from the body, how long does it stay in the body for. That really is the sole purpose of the phase 1 trial, and of course some safety signals as well. That can take anything from days, weeks to months. A lot depends on the results of that. And that is a really important phase because that will then determine the dose of the drug that will be used in subsequent phases of the trial. It is true that in sort of the world of rare diseases, we often combine a phase 1 with a phase 2 trial. Again, traditionally, a phase 2 trial really is a trial that looks at early signals of efficacy. Under ideal circumstances, is this drug efficacious? And is it safe? Right. So there is still some dosing adjustment. There is some adjustments of regimens, etc. So phase 3 is what they call, what in industry is often called a pivotal trial, i.e., it is the trial that would then allow them to take the data to go to the FDA to seek approval for that particular drug. Now, so how quickly it moves? So some studies will combine phase 1 and phase 2 together. There are actually some studies, less so perhaps in rare disorders, where phase 1 is actually in healthy volunteers. And the reason you want to do that, and in adults, the reason you want to do that is that if you have a brand new compound and you have no idea whether it works, you want to make sure that you test it in people in whom it at least, in whom you do not have other reasons to worry about safety issues. And you certainly do not want to test that in children because you really do not know how it responds. So the short answer to this is that there's no easy answer to that. It varies so much from drug to drug. I would say that if you look at the history of drug development, most drugs fail in either phase 1 or phase 2 stages. So the failure rate is actually really high. And drug companies want to know before they start a phase 3 trial, which will involve potentially up to 100 people or more. They want to know that this drug definitely has a very high potential of seeing the light of day when the phase 3 trial is completed, because it's incredibly expensive to conduct a phase 3 trial. So they need to know that they have a very high chance of success, and then they can put it into a phase 3 trial. And phase 3 trial is also where people often would then introduce a placebo group. So very often you'll find in phase 1, even phase 2 trial, there isn't a placebo group, there isn't a dummy pill. But once you get to phase 3, you need that in order to get FDA approval. I don't know if that sort of is a long-winded answer to what may seem to be a very simple question, but as I say, it just depends. If it takes a long time to get the answer we need to figure out the dose, then it's going to get delayed.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, Dr. Ochoa, when we're thinking about terms like inclusion and exclusion criteria, what in the world is that talking about? Uh-oh, you're muted. Hold on one second. Do you have control?
Yep. Thank you. Hi, everybody. So in clinical trials, a key step to be able to participate in a clinical trial is to meet inclusion criteria and to make sure that you don't have exclusion criteria to participate. And for instance, for the ASO clinical trials, the logical, so you have to have Angelman syndrome. And for some clinical trials, for all clinical trials, the deletion, you need to have a deletion. And at this time, the other mechanisms for Angelman syndrome are not inclusion criteria, or actually exclusion criteria for participating in the clinical trial. There's for one, and there can be some of the intragenic mutations of UB3A where you can participate, but not for the other. So different studies have different sets. These are like the game rules. So then the other important inclusion criteria for these ASO clinical trials are like participants need to be clinically stable. Like their seizures, then underlying medical conditions need to be very stable. And they often require, like in the last 3 months prior to participation in the study, there's no adjustment of the medications. And they are very adamant about that because, you are entering like an investigational drug, and if things are not going in the right direction, you won't know if that's because your seizure disorder or other underlying medical conditions are not very stable, or it's because of the study drug. So those are important to pay attention. And so there are some, there are also like exclusion criteria. There are some conditions that, or some clinical situations that may prevent, like for instance, sometimes if participants cannot be able to be assessed for the clinic, because we use measurements to assess efficacy of the drug, and we do those assessments at baseline before starting the study drug and then through the course of the study. And if participants for some reason cannot go through to these measurements of efficacy, then it's hard for them to participate, or if for some reasons parents cannot provide information consistently, or again, if there's like an underlying medical condition that is unstable, like a seizure disorder or any other medical problem. So those might be conditions that exclude this child from participating in a study.
Thank you, that's helpful. You know, I think that that's a really important piece of information to empower families. This information is publicly available, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. It's available on clinicaltrials.gov. And so I know when I'm looking for my patients or even for my own child, you know, when I go and look, that's the first thing that I look at. What's the age that's often, you know, listed there? There'll be an age inclusion criteria, molecular. Oh, we have Dr. Barry Kravitz, fabulous. You know, all the different rules of the game, as Dr. Ochoa put it. I think that's a great way to think about it. From the outset, is this something that's even going to be a possibility?
So one more thing that I think is important to say is, you know, families go very excited to the screening, and sometimes there's something. And for instance, I'm remembering now, we had a participant that everything was really good for the participation, and there was like an additional genetic variance, and we didn't think that was an issue. And but the sponsor, the company that is running the study, they said, no, we don't want to take any chance at this time. And they decided to exclude this family, which, you know, the family was bummed. And then we tried to talk to the monitor. We made a big deal, and they said no, we cannot. This is something that we cannot compromise. But they said that they would try to include this participant before the enrollment, that they were going to, but initially they wanted to get just the participants that didn't have any additional variation in the genetic makeup. So something I would like to say is, you know, it's important to talk to the coordinators ahead of time and try to be very open about those things. And if for some reason things don't work out at that time, it doesn't mean that they cannot participate at all, because it may be that these conditions become more stable over time, so they can enroll later, or sometimes in addition, in later phases of the study, they can be able to be enrolled and participate.
Yeah, well, you bring up a really good point here, and I think that this is going to become a little bit of a theme of the night, but at the end of the day, the sponsor gets to make a decision. The sponsor gets to decide. It's ultimately their decision. And so I'm going to turn to Dr. Barry Kravitz here to answer this question of delineating these roles here, the coordinator versus the sponsor versus the PI. Who are these people, and what is their role in a clinical trial?
So can I just add before we do that, following up on Dr. Ochoa's point about eligibility, inclusion, exclusion criteria, I think it is important to remember that the purpose of a clinical trial is to determine, as Dr. Dewey stated at the beginning, whether or not a drug, particular given drug, works in a given population. So in this case, in Angelman syndrome. In order to do that, the investigators and the sponsor need to ensure that the two groups, right? You have the group that's receiving the drug and the group that's receiving the sugar pill, the placebo pill, are comparable in every possible way. So in order to do that, we necessarily have to have a relatively narrow spectrum of what is eligible and who's eligible. Because just, you know, if you enroll in a clinical trial, a very heterogeneous group of participants, then if it works in, say, the placebo group, it doesn't work in the placebo group and works in the treatment group, for example, you don't really know whether it's because of something intrinsic about that participant or whether the drug actually works. Now, once the drug is approved, however, then you can use it in a much wider population. So, you know, in the example that Dr. Ochoa gave of this child with Angelman syndrome and another genetic condition, you really cannot enroll someone like that in a clinical trial because if that child responds or if that child does not respond. You do not know whether it's because of that other genetic condition, right? So you need to create a study population that is as pure, what I would call a pure Angelman population without any other factors that can influence your results in order to answer the question of, does this drug work? Once the drug works, it's on the market, then go for it by all means.
That's a great point. Yeah. All right, perfect. Dr. Bay-Kravis. We don't have your sound on. Is your sound accessible? Can't hear you yet. Let me see if I can turn on your speaker. You're unmuted. I can't hear you.
Liz, it looks like she joined with audio through her phone, maybe.
Okay.
Let me try to work with her if you want to move to another question.
Perfect. Yeah, well, I'm going to pass this question over to Dr. Duis then. Help us delineate the difference in the roles of the coordinator, the PI, and the sponsor. Who are these individuals?
So the sponsor is going to be the company running the study. And the sponsor often has a large team within their organization that will include, for example, a medical monitor. And the reason I mention that is because these questions that come up about who's eligible for the study, ultimately those questions go back to the sponsor to make that decision. And the PI or principal investigator is going to be the individual at that particular site where the clinical trial is happening. So they're going to often be the person that you meet who will do the physical exam and run the study and be in charge at that particular site of the safety issues that come up and patient issues that come up. And then the coordinator is unique to each site and works closely with that PI and often will be the first contact for the study, help you get things set up, often will help with consenting and administrative work around the study, helping to get visits set up and making sure things run smoothly. They'll often be the person to reach out to you and make sure that the different study parameters are being followed, that you're doing all the different pieces of the study that are supposed to be done at home, and often will be your first contact if you have any issues that come up related to the study.
Perfect, thank you. All right, Dr. Tan, so we've talked a little bit about screening. What is the screening process? What does it look like? Just because you get a screening visit, does that mean that you're into a clinical trial?
So again, the details of the screening procedures and the tests and assessments we will do during a screening visit will vary a lot depending on the clinical trial and the criteria. But the purpose of a screening visit is to help the investigators determine whether or not the potential participant meets the eligibility criteria. That's the sole purpose of a screening visit. And if you pass screening, meaning you meet all the eligibility criteria, then we will schedule a baseline visit, which is the first visit of the clinical trial, during which time you may or may not receive the actual medication, depending on the design of the trial.
Perfect, thank you. Dr. Ochoa, do you have any insight on how clinical trial sites are selected? You're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. So clinical trials are selected based on, the investigators. Usually, the sponsor is going to work with clinicians in the field who have expertise in the field, and everybody knows who is doing work in specific areas, like in Angelman syndrome, they all communicate. I guess they base that on the clinicians, the presence of clinics, prior experience on the sites doing clinical trials with this condition or with similar conditions.
Great, thank you. It's a common question that we get, and I think important to recognize that you are correct. It's ultimately the sponsor's decision on where the clinical trial sites are run, and generally they're seeking out centers that have expertise in the particular syndrome, whatever that might be, whether it be Angelman or all right, loaded question, and this is what everybody's asking. If a patient is interested in participating in a clinical trial, what should they do to make sure that they're, you know, have the best chances of being able to participate in a clinical trial? What do you think, Dr. Dewis?
I would say there's ways, to reach out to get on the list. There's wait lists to get on the trial, so reaching out to the closest site that you're aware of by looking on clinicaltrials.gov, or if the company has a contact, reaching out and letting them know that you're interested in participating in the clinical trial. Sometimes this can't be avoided, but I think trying to avoid starting new medications when you're hoping to get into a clinical trial, if that can be avoided, of course you should start medications that are clinically available to help your child if they're needed. But starting a new supplement should probably wait and see if you get into trials first, in case that would impact your eligibility. And then I think just waiting to hear. There are limited spots in these trials, but there will be more trials going forward. So like Wenhan mentioned, like Dr. Tan mentioned, there'll be multiple phases to the study. So there'll be other options to get into trials, but just making sure that your local site knows that you're interested. And also I would say going on clinicaltrials.gov and looking at some of those eligibility criteria are really helpful in familiarizing yourself with who they're recruiting for the trials, whether your child's in the age range that makes sense, whether they have the particular subtype of Angelman, and having that information available to send to the site if they reach out to you and want to start looking at whether your child's eligible.
It's perfect. As this has become such a focal point of many clinic visits, this is, as you know, part of our visits at UNC, I always tell families, if you think you're interested in hearing about research opportunities, clinical trials, let our research coordinator know that. And then if a trial comes up that you meet eligibility criteria for, they would know that you might be interested in participating in something like that. So I definitely agree. And reaching out to the sponsor, if there are, usually there are patient relations folks within these pharmaceutical companies, and their job is to reach out and interface with the communities. And so, beyond letting individual clinic sites know, that's also a good point of contact.
Hey, Liz, I just want you to know Dr. Kravis is on now.
Perfect. I was just about to turn to you, Dr. Kravis. Big question here. We hear this a lot. How are sites selecting who gets to participate in a clinical trial or who gets screened for a clinical trial?
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, so that's a particularly difficult thing, especially when a clinical trial is a small early trial and there's like 20 slots in it and everyone wants to be in it. So sometimes it comes down to, it obviously will come down to who meets the entry criteria. And, you have to screen everybody, but sometimes it just comes down to who asks you first, because there's just no other way to put people in a list. For instance, when the genetics trial opened and we were the only site open, we had 150 people tell us in a 2 or 3 day period. And so we actually just we had the timestamp of your email or your phone call, and we just put everyone in time order, and you went in according to the time that you called us, because, and of course we had to pre-screen and talk to people and find out if they would qualify, and there were a few that got high on our list but didn't qualify, so then we moved to the next one. But that was really just what we did, was a systematic approach, and that's what we've done with other trials. I think a lot of it depends on interest, and when there's a lot of interest, it depends on kind of who calls you first, and then out of those people, who is eligible to participate. So I don't know of any other good way of doing it when there's really a lot of interest, because you don't want to be biased to one group of people or another. You want to be even in terms of how you respond to people.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so what are some things, I'm going to direct this at Dr. Tan. What are some things that you think families should consider when they're making decisions about potentially signing up for a clinical trial or potentially enrolling?
Well, I think they should, first of all, consult with their own physician to discuss the potential benefits and risks of clinical trials. I will emphasize that all clinical trials have potential benefits, but also potential risks. And the reason we do clinical trials is because we do not know whether this medication is safe and whether it's effective. If we know that it is definitely safe and effective, then we wouldn't be doing a clinical trial. So, and depending on the design of the trial, there's also a chance that the trial may get randomized to a placebo arm, and they need to decide, is that something they are willing to accept? We do, of course, want to encourage parents to participate in these trials. And as I've sort of mentioned before in previous conferences, that it is really important that we have families who are willing to participate in a clinical trial, knowing that they may be on a placebo arm, because that's the only way we can figure out whether or not a particular drug works. Without a placebo, you will never be able to fully determine whether it is just due to chance or whether this drug actually works. So once they have decided that they might be interested, then they should talk to the investigator conducting the clinical trial to ask them questions like, what are the potential side effects? What are the potential benefits? What does it entail? I think it's really important to know when you're participating in a clinical trial, how many times do you have to be on site? Are you going to be sedated? How often are you going to be sedated? What are the procedures? What are the risks associated with those procedures? So I think it's all about risk-benefit consideration. I think those are the key things I would sort of emphasize that families should ask their physician. They should also think about timing, right? Is this a really hectic time for your family? If so, that maybe that's not a great time. Maybe this is a good time because everything else in your life is a little bit more settled. Because once you participate in a clinical trial like this, very often there will be multiple follow-up phone calls. So this again comes down to knowing what participation in a clinical trial entails. How often are you going to be called? How often do you have a record, sleep diary or movement diary, seizure diary, anything like that? Yeah.
Great. That's really helpful. Dr. Ochoa, this question we get asked often about traveling for clinical trials or relocating for clinical trials. Are there general guidances about this issue?
I just would like to make a point from before I answer your question about what Dr. Tan was saying. The gold standard for clinical trials is to do placebo control, studies where you have a placebo group and another group that receives the drug. But at this time, just to clarify, in the ASO studies, we don't have a placebo group. Everybody's getting the drug. That was a decision made by the sponsors. And I think another risk to keep in mind when making a decision about participating is your child, your angel, how much is your angel going to tolerate going to the hospital and spending hours because it's a little bit of time that they have to be there, and not everybody has that kind of tolerance to go through procedures, to get to know a lot of people, and that's something important to keep in mind. And also, like, I think different families have different degrees of tolerance to risk, right? Like we see that with the COVID. Some people are a little more laid back about it. Everybody needs to be careful and follow the guidelines, but some people get a little more stressed out about it, and some people are more laid back about it. And I think the same, you know, going to these studies is gonna bring risk for side effects. There can be side effects, and some families can tolerate those risks a little more than others. So, talking about relocating, you know, I think it's hard to make a decision about relocating for participating in a clinical trial. You know, it's a little bit like a lottery, you know, participating at this time in these ASO clinical trials. And I think everybody wants to get it ASAP. And you know, being first is, you know, ideally we want young children to get the ASOs and try to start working on them as soon as possible. But there are so many variables, and like, you know, the sites have different quotas to fill, and but they have different waiting lists too. And I've heard of families that moved, relocated, and somehow they didn't made inclusion criteria, had some exclusion criteria, and could not participate. So I personally would say families should not relocate. They should follow the advice discussed here, try to contact their site, get in their waiting list, and eventually this is going to open up to everybody. So there are some signals that are positive, and if we confirm that this works, this is going to become available to everybody eventually. So I would advise against relocating for participating.
I think you bring up a lot of good, really generalizable points here. You know, really fully understanding what participation looks like. You know, our goal here tonight was to be really quite generalizable and not specific to these particular trials. These particular trials that are ongoing right now may be quite time intensive and labor intensive, but perhaps others are not and are less, but really understanding what that time commitment looks like and what that means for your particular child and whether they can tolerate that or not, or adult patient with Angelman or Dup15q. And then, yes, understanding before making a very large decision like relocating, that just relocating is not a guarantee that you will have a spot in a clinical trial, and that there may be some clinical trials where relocation is discouraged or, you know, very strongly recommended against. There may be studies that the sponsor won't allow relocation. And to this point, Dr. Berry-Kravis, if a patient lives internationally and clinical trials are only happening in a different country, is there any guidance about traveling internationally or international relocation?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
All right. So that varies according to the trial. We've had many trials that we ran in Fragile X and in other diseases where people flew in from Canada. We had one trial where we had people flying in from Costa Rica. So people can come if you're allowed to participate in the trial from another country. Then that's fine. In general, all the trial activities are carried out at the trial site in the USA. So you have to actually travel to the USA for every clinical study visit. But if the sponsor allows people from another country to come in to be in a trial, and of course in a trial like an ASO trial, you're not taking drug out of the country because you're getting all the drug while you're in the country. So there's nothing to try to get past customs. But even if you're participating, in our next trial, we have a number of people coming. We have a couple from China and one from France, and so those we just write a letter, and then those people can take the medication with them overseas and through customs. So in general, there's not really a limitation about whether you can come from another country. It's mostly if the sponsor says you can't come from another country, then we can't enroll.
Great.
We have actually had, there's another variation on this. There's the person who lives in another country and doesn't want to live in that country. They want to live in the USA. And then they get into a trial for their child's disease, and it makes it hard for them. They have to do frequent visits. So then we write them a medical excuse that they need to stay in the USA. And sometimes they wind up staying in the USA long enough that they can move here permanently. So I have seen, I'm pretty sure that certain people that have participated in our trials have actually used it as a way to move to the USA. But technically they're not officially doing that for the trial.
Gotcha. I think the important takeaway that I hear is really it's if the sponsor allows it, there's not rules against it, but again, it's not a guarantee that you'd be, enrolled in a clinical study unless you pass.
Just to add to that, two things. One, it's usually not a case of whether or not the sponsor allows. I think the key considerations here are, one, is the family from overseas able and willing to come for every single study visit? So there are some trials where you need to be physically present at the study site multiple times a year. We certainly in the past have enrolled patients in our previous clinical trial that required only a baseline visit and a one-year visit. And we had families from not just Canada, but from Europe, from South America, and elsewhere coming to the study. But the other major issue really is language. Some of our assessments can only be performed and would only be valid if performed in English. So if it is a non-English speaking family, or at least a child is exposed to a non-English family in a non-English environment, then the investigator in conjunction with the sponsor would need to decide whether or not that those measures are actually valid. And if not, that might preclude participation in the trial.
Those are all really good clarifications. I appreciate that. All right. All right. So we've tackled a lot of what ifs about getting into a clinical trial and considering whether you should or whether you're interested in a clinical trial. But let's go now into the theoretical situation that you're in a clinical trial. A family is participating in a clinical trial. Dr. Duis, are there best practices or rules about sharing your experiences with others in the community once you're in a clinical trial?
Yeah, particularly for treatment trials, we ask that you not share any experience in Facebook groups, social media, phone calls. It's best to not even share that you're participating in the clinical trial with other individuals unless they're involved in the care of your child. So another caretaker, of course, should know that they're on an experimental medication, but and your providers at home, of course, should know that you're in a clinical trial and participating in a clinical trial. But we ask that not be shared, and that's for several reasons. The main one being that it could interfere with the results of the clinical trial, and that's something that none of us want to happen because we want these drugs, if they're successful, to come to the community as quickly as possible. So if there's a lot of sharing of, especially between individuals, families who both have children in the trial, if there's a lot of sharing of, oh, my child's doing this, or I think this is related to the drug, then it could influence how people think their child is responding to the drug. So we try to avoid all communication about the fact that your child's participating in a clinical trial, except for key people who need to know.
It's really important.
Can I just mention, there's a caveat to that. We often tell people who are in trials not to tell anyone at school that they're in the trial or in experimental medicine, because we get much better information from school if the school people don't know that the person is doing something, that to expect changes. So unless there's an absolute need to know for a medical reason, which usually there isn't in trials, we usually suggest that people keep therapists and school providers blinded so that we can get a blinded assessment of how the child is doing.
I definitely agree with that. I guess the main thing is that anybody who's going to be taking care of the child in the sense of looking for side effects or concerns, or someone like a babysitter or nanny should definitely know about the trial. But I think that is a huge source of helpful information to talk with people who don't know the child in the trial and see if they've noticed any differences.
That's great. All right, Dr. Berry-Kravis, how soon do we expect to hear results from any given study?
Well, that varies a lot depending on how long the study is. So if typically, you have a study and it lasts 6 months or a year, and then you're going to enroll people, and then after you enroll the last person, you have to wait till the last person has gone through the entire study. And then there's something called database lock. And then database lock is where the sponsor is bugging the sites to get their coordinators to enter all their data into the computer. And so it depends on how fast the sites work to get that all cleaned up, and then they lock the database. And after that, the data is considered the data. And it's there's no going back. So it's usually a couple months after a trial ends where you actually get results. Now, sometimes a trial is stopped in the middle because of a safety event, or there's a planned, okay, we're going to analyze the data after this much time, and then we're going to move on another period of time. And so then they'll lock the database at the time, at the time that the study is paused. And then you'll get kind of an interim result. This is what happened with the genetic study, is they had a bad side effect, and so they did a database lock. We made sure everything was in on the patients that had been in, and then they analyzed that data. And then when they restart the study, the database will be open again, and then there won't be any more data until the next stopping point. Sometimes a phase 1-2 study will roll continuously into a phase 2-3 study, depending on if it's a rare disease. And there are all these kind of novel models for, how to move to approval if you see it. And that depends a little bit on how dramatic an effect you're seeing. And then sometimes there's several database locks along there. So it can vary. I mean, it may be traditionally after a placebo-controlled randomized trial, the database locks after everyone is through the trial and the database is full. So I would think that you wouldn't expect, for instance, in a study like the Roche study where they've got multiple cohorts and they have to finish those, I don't think we're going to see like actual data from that study, for instance, until next fall or something. So it always seems like it's too long to wait. But the truth is, you want to make sure everything is organized and put in so that you can get the best possible result before you unlock the database.
So while patients are waiting, or while the community is waiting, we get a lot of questions about, if you participate in the first phase of a study, will you continue to get drug potentially while you're waiting for all of that data to be analyzed, or phase 3 to come around?
That's me.
Yes.
Yeah, so that varies depending on whether the study has an extension or not. So some studies do not have an extension. Often, early phase trials of a small molecule, for instance, for depression or for anxiety or even for Fragile X, have had, there's a set time in the study, and then when you're done with the drug, you're done with the drug, and you wait until the study reads out a result. Often when a company is doing a phase 3 study, they will do an open label extension because they need to get 1 year safety data in general before they get drug approval. So it's more common to be able to stay on the drug after a phase 3 study. Now, there are these other situations where, for instance, you think the effect of the drug may accumulate over a long time. So, or you think you may be able to see the result better after 2 or 3 years as opposed to after 1 year. And so then in that case, often there will be an extension, but the extension will be to collect long-term efficacy data that might not be available to you after a shorter study. So it really depends on whether the sponsor is running an open label extension or not as to whether you can go back on the drug. Some sponsors have allowed in a rare disease a person to be in a phase 2 study and then also participate in the phase 3 study as long as they're never unblinded as to which group they were in the phase 2 study, and then they can go into an open label extension out of the phase 3 study. So there are all sorts of setups, but it really just depends on what the plan is with the sponsor and where they are in terms of trying to collect this long-term data, whether it's for efficacy or for safety.
Gotcha.
And also they have to have a certain amount of toxicity studies in an animal, like they have to have long-term toxicity studies done in an animal to allow you to stay in long-term on an open label extension. So that's another limiting factor, and that's dependent on the sponsor getting that data.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, while patients are waiting for a phase 3 to open or for phase 1-2 data to be analyzed, there may be an open label extension where patients continue to get the drug, presuming that we're waiting for a phase 3. Typically, the phase 1-2 patients would not be the same patients that would participate in a phase 3 study.
Typically not.
But those
That
patients
has happened,
would continue to get.
but yeah. If they're in an open label, if they go in an open label extension after phase 1 or 2, they will not be in the phase 3 study. If there's no open label study after the early phases, sometimes they will be allowed to re-enroll in the phase 3 study as long as they're blinded to treatment status in the first study.
Gotcha. Dr. Tan, this is a tough question. If families feel like a medication was useful, but a drug fails to meet its primary endpoints for efficacy, and the drug, so-called fails the clinical trial, do families continue to have access to that medication, or what happens in that scenario?
So that's a challenging situation. I think it comes down to, one, what that medication is and what the sponsor decides. If the medication under study had already been FDA approved for another indication, then there's nothing to stop any clinician from prescribing that medication to the children off-label. And we actually do that in pediatrics all the time. I actually remind parents, and Dr. Gilazzo is a pediatrician, and she knows that Tylenol, acetaminophen, was never studied in children. So technically, Tylenol is not FDA approved for use in children. And yet, obviously, you can buy not just a prescription, you can get it over the counter. So just because a medication has not been approved for use in a particular population does not mean that it cannot be prescribed. However, if that medication under study has never been approved by the FDA, it's not available for any other purpose, then I think if the sponsor withdraws it, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about giving it, unless it's available in Europe, in Canada, in other places, and you can get it, across the border. I'm not sort of suggesting that families do that, but there are some medications that are only approved in other countries, not in the US. There are some complex laws as to whether or not you're even allowed to bring those medications in for personal consumption, but so I wouldn't want to go there.
Great food.
That's the bottom line. It just depends on the nature of the medication, whether it's already approved for other indications.
That's great. All right, we're getting through our list of questions here from the community. I have one last question and we have 4 minutes. If a child meets inclusion criteria, do the parents get to choose which phase they would enroll their child in? I will give this back to Dr. Duis.
The short answer is no. I think that in the case of a clinical trial, if it's actively recruiting and you've gone through screening and you're found to meet the inclusion criteria, you would move forward with enrollment, because if you meet inclusion criteria, that doesn't save you a spot for future phases of the trial. Also, sometimes inclusion and exclusion criteria change as you go through the different phases of the trial. So sometimes specific information that becomes available in an earlier phase of the study can influence the future inclusion-exclusion criteria that are utilized. So if you find that you can be included in a study and signed up to go for that screening visit, then if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, I would recommend taking that opportunity at that time.
Great. And on that question, Dr. Ochoa, if your child screens into a clinical trial or is offered enrollment, are families required to enroll?
Yes, ideally, if a family is given the slot, there can be particular circumstances that prevent a family, and if there are legitimate circumstances that prevent them from participating, but it's not just because they want to be in the next cohort, then you can work around them. But I don't think people have the option to choose in what part. And I also want to add, to the question that you asked Dr. Tan, we had a similar experience at Rush. We ran a series of clinical trials for patients with Down syndrome using a GABA allosteric modulator. And this was like an international pharmaceutical company. And it seemed to work really well. We had the phase 2 was really exciting, the results. And in phase 3, we're halfway into the study. We're in a phase 2/3 for young children. And when the results came for the other phase study, they were negative. And the company decided to stop the trial. And this was a drug that a lot of families thought that was helping their children. And this was not an FDA approved drug, and they have the patent. So there was no, they stopped the access to this drug, which was, a lot of families were upset about that.
Highlighting the roller coaster experience that it can be to participate in a clinical trial for a family. We are right at our time limit here. Does anybody have any parting thoughts, things that we haven't covered tonight that you think are really important points for families to consider when thinking about enrolling in a clinical trial or considering a clinical trial for their family?
No, but I would like to encourage all families to really consider participating in clinical trials. We appreciate there's a lot of time, a lot of effort on the part of the families, but without clinical trials, we'll never move forward as a community. The only way we can advance therapies for Angelman syndrome is to have clinical trials and to have families who are generous enough to donate their time and effort to participate in these trials, even if it means that there's a chance that your child may end up in the placebo group, because at the end of the day, if the drug is effective, you will be able to get it through prescription.
Thank you.
I want to say the families are really our partners in this enterprise, and it's our job to make it as easy as possible within the constraints of the trial to participate. And it's your job to do everything according to the protocol that we tell you, and not go off and deviate on your own and do something that isn't on the protocol. And if we work together that way, then we're going to have the best results.
Awesome.
So I would like to add one more thing, and it's like you said, it's a roller coaster for families, and sometimes there are side effects when you participate in the studies. But I think the investigators, the people that work in this field, really care for our patients. And when things don't go in the right direction, we're there, we're available, and we are there to troubleshoot together, to work through the potential side effects together. And
we love you all for this. We know how much of your time that this takes as well. This is not an insignificant amount of time for clinicians to run clinical trials as well. Dr. Duis.
I just wanted to add, if you're at all interested in participating in the clinical trials, I think it is a good idea to reach out either to the patient relations part of the sponsor or to local sites and get on the list. And then, we will help you navigate through those inclusion-exclusion criteria. There's a lot of anxiety out there about participating, and we've had a few patients come through and say, oh, I don't think we'll get in, so I'm just not going to put my name on the list. But then they have a lot of anxiety about what the future holds. Let us sort through who's coming through. We're trying to be very fair about who gets in based on when they've contacted us, and and also think about inclusion and exclusion criteria with you to see if you're a good fit.
And I'll echo that from the clinician side. This is a totally reasonable thing to have a whole visit to talk about with your clinicians, talk about what the clinical trial landscape looks like, what options might be interesting to your family, what sort of risks you're willing to take, you know, what your risk tolerance level is. These are all important conversations to have with your clinician. So we appreciate all of your time tonight. I think this has been really helpful for the community. For participants tonight who are watching, if there are other questions, please, we will accumulate any questions from the chat box and make sure they get answered and sent back out to the community in an FAQ fashion. So thank you all for your time. We really appreciate you all. Thank you for everything you're doing for both of our communities, and we look forward to continuing this wild west of clinical trials with you all over the coming years. Thank you.